Holes Chapter 43. We weren't always homeless, Zero said. I remember a yellow room. How old were you when you, Stanley started to ask, but couldn't find the right words. Moved out. I don't know, I must have been real little because I don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I remember standing in a crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrist and made me clap my hands together. She used to sing this song to me, that one you sang, but different though. Zero spoke slowly, as if he was searching in his brain for memories and clues. And then later, I know we lived on the street, but I don't know why we left the house. I'm pretty sure it was a house, but not an apartment. I know my room was yellow. It was late afternoon. They were resting in the shadow of the thumb. They had spent the morning picking onions and putting them in the sack. It didn't take long, but long enough so that they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave at the first hint of daylight, so they'd have plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure he could find the right hole. Then they would hide by it until everyone went to sleep. They would dig for as long as it seemed safe, and not a second longer. And then, treasure or no treasure, they'd head up the dirt road. If it was absolutely safe, they'd try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, Zero had said. Remember, Stanley had warned, the door to the rec room squeaks. Now he lay on his back, trying to save the strength for the long days ahead. He wondered what happened to Zero's parents, but he didn't ask. Zero didn't like answering questions. It was better just to let him talk when he felt like it. Stanley thought about his own parents. In his last letter, his mom was worried that they may be evicted from their apartment because of the smell from the burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if they'd been told that he'd run away from camp. Were they told that he was dead? An image appeared in his head of his parents hugging each other and crying. He tried not to think about it. Instead, he tried to recapture the feelings that he'd had the night before. The inexplicable feeling of happiness, the sense of destiny. But those feelings didn't return. He just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They dunked their caps in the water hole before putting them on their heads. Zero held the shovel, and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions and 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of the broken jar on the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing out a patch of weeds. Zero turned and looked up toward the top of the mountain. That's a long way. You were light, Stanley said. You had already thrown up everything inside your stomach. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped on a loose rock, slipped, then fell hard. Then the next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack and the onions spilled all around him. He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed one onto a thorny vine. The vine was wrapped around the earth, but slowed him enough so that he was able to stop himself. Are you all right? Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled out a thorn from his palm and said, Yeah. He was all right. He was worried more about the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Stanley pulled some of the thorns out of his pant legs. The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected them, like styrofoam packing material. Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me, Zero said. They lost about a third of the onions, but recovered many as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was just rising above the lake. They walked toward it. Soon they stood on the ledge of a cliff, looking down the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he saw the remains of Mary Lou off into the distance. You thirsty? Stanley asked. No, said Zero. How about you? No, Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink. Although they didn't mention it, it had become a challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. It was a different spot where they had climbed up. They eased themselves down from the one ledge to another and let themselves slide in other places. Being especially careful with the sack, Stanley could no longer see Mary Lou, but headed in what he thought was the right direction. As the sun rose, so did a familiar haze of heat and dirt. You thirsty? Zero asked. No, said Stanley. Because you have 3 full jars of water, said Zero. I thought it would maybe be too heavy for you. If you drink some, it will lighten your load. I'm not thirsty, said Stanley. But if you want a drink, I'll give you some. I'm not thirsty, said Zero. I was just worried about you. Stanley smiled. I'm a camel, he said. They walked for what seemed like a long time and still never came across the Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they were heading in the right direction. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were headed toward the setting sun. Now they were heading toward the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise exactly in the east or west, more southeast, southwest, but he wasn't sure how that made a difference. His throat felt as if it was coated with sandpaper. You sure you're not thirsty? He asked. Not me, said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. When they finally did take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. Zero, who was now carrying the sack, set it down and took out 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last, since it couldn't actually break. You know I'm not thirsty, Stanley said. As he unscrewed the lid. I'm just drinking so you will. I'm just drinking so you will, said Zero. They clinked the jars together, and each watching the other pour the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first to spot Mary Lou, maybe a quarter mile away, and just a little off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. I don't know what happened to my mother, Zero said. She left and never came back. Stanley peeled an onion. She couldn't always take me with her, Zero said. Sometimes she had to do things by herself. Stanley had the feeling that Zero was explaining things to himself. She told me to wait in a certain place for her. When I was real little, I had to wait in small areas like on a porch or a doorway. Now don't leave here until I get back, she'd say. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, and I'd hug it. The whole time she was gone. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in bigger areas, like stay on this block or don't leave the park, and even if I still had Jackie. Stanley guessed that Jackie was the name of Zero's giraffe. And then one day she didn't come back, Zero said. His voice said suddenly hollow. I waited for her at Laney Park. Laney Park, said Stanley. I've been there. You know the playscape, said Zero. Yeah, I played on it. I waited there for almost a month, said Zero. I waited there for more than a month, said Zero. You know that tunnel you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept. They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about a half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around the corner. Everything looked all the same in all directions. When I left camp, I was heading straight toward Big Thumb. I saw the boat off to the right, so that means that we have to turn a little to the left. Zero was lost in thought. What? Okay, he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kids had a birthday party, Zero said. I guess it was about 2 weeks after my mom left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape with balloons, and balloons were tied to it. The kids looked to be the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew that I didn't belong at the party, even though it wasn't their playscape. There was this one mother who kept staring at me, like I was some kind of monster. Then later a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake. But then that same mother said, "Go away," and she told all the kids to stay away from me. So I never got a piece of cake. I ran away so fast I forgot Jaffe. Did you ever find it? For a moment, Zero didn't answer. Then he said, he wasn't. Stanley thought again about his own parents, how awful it would be for them to never know if he was dead or alive. He realized that was how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero mentioned his father. Hold on, Zero said, stopping abruptly. We're going the wrong way. No, this is the right way, said Stanley. You were headed toward Big Thumb when you saw the boat to your right, said Zero. That means we should have turned right when we saw the boat. You sure? Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. Stanley still wasn't sure. We need to go this way, said Zero, first drawing a line on the map and then heading that way himself. Stanley followed. It didn't seem right, but Zero seemed so sure. Sometime in the mid of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked the sun. It was a welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt that destiny was on his side. Zero stopped and held out his arm to stop Stanley too. Listen, Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly, and Stanley began to make out the faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were still too far away to see the camp, but he could hear the blend of indistinct voices. As they got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Stur's distinctive bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware that sounds travel in both directions. They approached the cluster of holes. "Let's wait here until they go in," said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure there was nothing living in it, then climbed down into the hole. Zero climbed to the one next to him. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley had expected. Now they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud, and Stanley felt its rays beating down on him. But soon more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley and his hole. He waited until he was certain the last of the campers had finished for the day. Then he waited a little longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed out for their holes and crept toward camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradled his arms, and set it over his shoulder to keep the jars from clanking against each other. A wave of terror rushed over him as he saw the compound, the tents, the rec room, the warden's cabin under the 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. He took a breath, summoned the courage, and continued. "That's the one," he whispered, pointing out of the hole where he found the gold tooth. It was about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down into the adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep.